I want to welcome everybody today. I'm Dennis Cooley. I am the director of the Northern Plains Ethics Institute. This public forum is part of the Exploring Academic Freedom and Freedom of Speech project that is being sponsored by the Northern Plains Ethics Institute at NDSU, Tri-College University, Humanities, North Dakota State University Student Government, and NDSU College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences. So I'm going to introduce the two speakers and then our moderator who is online. Howard Dahl is president and CEO of Amity Technology LLC in Fargo. He earned degrees from the University of North Dakota and Trinity Evangelical Divinity School and has done graduate work in philosophy at the University of Florida. By the way, I'm a philosopher too, so I'm very pleased by that. Dahl is a member of a number of boards, including the Russian American Institute's Board of Regents, Trinity Forum's Board of Trustees, Ethics and Public Policy Center's Board of Directors, and the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition. Dahl has also served as Director and Audit Chair for the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis, as a board member of the North Dakota Trade Office. Among Dahl's awards are Fargo Moorhead Business of the Year, North Dakota Agricultural Person of the Year, North Dakota Innovator of the Year, North Dakota Exporter of the Year, Fargo Moorhead Small Businessman of the Year, and Amity Technologies, the first North Dakota company to be the SBA Region 7 Exporter of the Year. To his left is Jack Zaleski, who is an award-winning journalist who retired in 2017 after 30 years as editorial page editor of the Forum of Fargo Moorhead. He is the author of 2020's Forum Communications Company, A Narrative History, 1980 to 2018. A native of New Britain, Connecticut, Zaleski was educated at New Britain Public Schools and at the University of Connecticut at Storrs, where he worked for a short time at the university's Office of Public Information. Zaleski is a member of the North Dakota Newspaper Association's 50-year club and a former member of the National Conference of Editorial Writers and the NCEW Foundation Board of Directors. His honors for editorials and opinion columns include 2 first-place Herman Rowe Editorial Writing Awards from the Minnesota Newspaper Association and several top honors from the NDNA, the most recent in 2017 for his opinion and commentary pages. He serves on the advisory board of the Northern Plains Ethics Institute at NDSU, an organization that publishes analyses and commentaries and sponsors public debates and discussions on issues of the day. Dr. Faith Ngungiri is a native of Kenya who has lived in the United States since 2003. She has a doctorate in leadership studies from Bowling Green State University from 2006 and worked at the Yale Center for Faith and Culture in the Ethics and Spirituality in the Workplace program and at Eastern University before joining Concordia College and being appointed the director of the Lawrenson Center for Faith and Work. She is interested in the intersections of faith and spirituality and work in leadership as a research focus. One of her primary research interests is women in leadership, where she explores African women leaders, African-American clergy women, and minority women leaders in higher education using tempered radicalism, servant leadership, and spirituality as conceptual frameworks. She is also interested in studying women as global leaders. Her work has been published in the Journal of Research Practice, the Journal of Business Communication, GENDA, a Journal of Culture and African and Women Studies, International and Intercultural Communications Annual, and Gendered Perspectives in International Development. Her first book, titled Women's Spiritual Leadership in Africa, Tempered Radicals and Critical Servant Leaders, was published by SUNY Press in 2010. Professor Ngungiri is our moderator, and our two speakers, and what we're going to do is have a conversation. I'm going to turn it over now to Professor Ngungiri, if we can get her up. Okay. Oh, let's welcome our speakers, sorry.
All right, good afternoon, everybody, and good afternoon to Jack and Howard. It's really a pleasure for me to be moderating this conversation today, being as I'm no longer in Fargo Moorhead. I'm no longer at Concordia College. I quit last month. So it's nice to have one more chance to engage with the community that has been home for me for the last 8 years plus. So Howard and Jack, I want to read a quick quote here and then let you engage from the perspective of what all this means to you in journalism, in business, in the world in which you exist. So this is, I'm reading from The Atlantic. This is a quote from Jonathan Haidt, who I know, Howard, you know well in terms of reading his work. And he says, freedom of speech is the eternally radical idea that individuals would try to settle their differences through debate and discussion, through evidence and attempts at persuasion, rather than through the coercive power of administrative authorities or violence. Howard, why don't we start with you? Tell us, what is freedom of speech? What is this thing we're talking about from your perspective, from your world?
Faith, it's so good to see you. And we have, Faith and I have a very, very dear mutual friend that has had a big influence in both our lives, and who teaches at Princeton. I'm glad you introduced with Jonathan Haidt. I was going to speak to his role in our world today, which I think is very important. But, I was going to be preface that with my passion for free speech, free press, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly comes from spending a lot of time in Russia. Over 30 years spending time there. And the reason even people who are Russian natives living in Eastern Ukraine want to be Ukrainian as opposed to Russian is those freedoms. There's true freedom of speech in Russia, in Ukraine, freedom of press, although Zaleski yesterday or 2 days ago shut down some TV stations and shut down some political parties. I have some questions about that, but all in all, there's complete freedom. Russia had it for a short period of time, where late night comedians made fun of Yeltsin all night long, and it was just a very short window for a while. But when I see what it's like to live in a world without freedom of press, speech, it's created really deep convictions for me. And I see my Russian friends and Russian employees who are afraid to say anything. They're afraid to say things legally. What I see in America is a bunch of people are afraid to say things culturally. Mm-hmm. Not illegal yet, but there's a cultural role that is part of a civil society. It's very, very important. So Jonathan Haidt, I was going to actually begin my remarks with him. About 20 years ago, he's a famous social psychologist at NYU, although he's not sure if he's still at NYU, I think he is. He spoke to a conference of 1,000 social psychologists in Houston. And he decided to do an experiment. He said, how many of you consider yourself liberal? And out of the 1,000, 950 raised their hand. How many of you consider yourself moderate? 25 or whatever. How many consider yourself libertarian? There are 20 or so. How many of you consider yourself conservative? There were 5. He thought that was going to be the result. And he wrote the book called The Righteous Mind. And he basically, his argument is we don't listen to each other well. We just set out our platitudes, but we don't listen well. And his book was a plea for 7 qualities that characterize a civil society. 4 of them, he said, conservatives do better. 3 of them, liberals do better. We need to learn from each other. And his great book, The Coddling of the American Mind, basically says we don't have any resiliency. We're raising a bunch of kids who aren't used to facing any conflict, any disagreements, any challenges. And so resilience is being lost. And I think we saw that at Yale Law School last week, where 100 students shouted down an atheist and a member who were just going to have a discussion of how you can have opposite views and yet can have a conversation and still like each other. the program never happened because these 100 law students shouted down saying, we can't have this speech on our campus. And so Jonathan Haidt's organization that he started, the Heterodox Academy, is exactly about that. It's trying to create a world in which disagreements can be had without being disagreeable. And that's the real challenge. So thanks for bringing it up.
All right, Jack.
Well, I have spent a career in newsrooms, sort of, I guess, would be on the front lines of this debate, which has changed over that time. The academic debate is one thing. The practical nuts and bolts application of how freedom of speech is dealt with by people sitting at their kitchen table writing a letter to the editor or going to their city council meeting or calling out me at the newspaper and raising hell because I didn't publish their letter is more of a concrete kind of in-your-face dealing with First Amendment principles that are not below the academic discussion of free speech, but are much more pragmatic and kind of a realistic and real discussion. We can have discussions at universities with people who pretty much agree. The students at Yale you just mentioned about some of these issues and read these very well done essays on free speech and what it means to the culture and to the country. But when you deal with people daily who don't necessarily have anything to do with the academic discussion, but have an instinctive feeling, a belief about what free speech means to them, is what I did. So what I started to do is, when we were talking about doing this program, I did a little background, and it was interesting to see how free speech in the United States has evolved in the body of law that has been written and that's in place over the last 100 or so years regarding free speech. I went back and dug up a few of the cases that I think were hot button issues through history and affect people's lives directly. And when we look at this, this comes from, by the way, this comes from the Administrative Office of the U.S. Courts. They update this routinely as the law changes, as the Supreme Court acts. But as of recently, here's what freedom of speech, according to the body of law that's in place now, includes. Freedom of speech includes the right, and this is an interesting one, not to speak. Specifically, the right not to salute the flag was the case. This is from 1943. Think of what was going on in 1943. The Supreme Court said, you know, the right not to salute the flag is protected by the First Amendment. Freedom of speech includes the right of students to wear black armbands to school to protest a war. And the words of the court then were, students do not shed their constitutional rights at the schoolhouse gate. That's from 1969. Freedom of speech includes the right to use offensive words and phrases to convey political messages. Now, that should be a surprise to no one if you've been listening to the political discourse for the last 10 years or so. But that's from 1971 that you see it. And this one, which has always caused some consternation among people, freedom of speech includes the right to contribute money under certain circumstances to political campaigns, and that decision came down from the court. In 1976, it opened up the spigots for money in politics, more money in politics. Freedom of speech includes the right to advertise commercial products and professional services with the restrictions that you expect. And that comes from a case in Virginia regarding pharmaceutical ads. Remember, there was a time when pharmaceutical ads were not run. This was brought by a pharmacy group, and the Supreme Court said, yeah, you can do that. Freedom of speech includes the right to engage in symbolic speech. And this is one that's been a hot button issue forever, and that by the example they use is burning the flag in protest. And as you might expect, this was reaffirmed again in 1989 and again in 1990. So symbolic speech is protected. But what I think a lot of people don't know, that according to the body of law we're working with now, and we work with the newsrooms, freedom of speech does not include the right to incite imminent lawless action. And that decision goes back to 1969. That's not a new one. Freedom of speech does not include the right to distribute or make obscene materials. That's been in place for a long time. And this one, I didn't even know was in place, and I should as a child in the 1960s. Freedom of speech does not protect the right to burn draft cards as an anti-war protest. I did not know that. And that's in the 1968 decision. And freedom of speech does not permit students to print articles in a school newspaper over the objections of the administration. And this is a 1988 decision where the administration was viewed as a publisher. For instance, if my publisher told me that I can't print a certain thing on the page, on the editorial page, he would have the right to do that. In this case, the Supreme Court, the court said that the administration of a school can say the same thing to the staff of the school newspaper. Freedom of speech doesn't include the right of students to make an obscene speech at a school-sponsored event. And finally, freedom of speech doesn't include the right of students to advocate illegal drug use at a school-sponsored event. But my point in reading those out is that freedom of speech is not absolute, and it never has been. And some people, you might hear people speak now about this and say, listen, it's my right to say anything I want. Well, it isn't, and there are certain restrictions, and we've seen some of those restrictions be brought into play over the last few years with some of the political speech that we've seen. So it's an evolving body of law. It always has been. We go back as far as Jefferson, who was a freedom of speech advocate, until he had somebody, go after him, a pamphleteer, and say very nasty things about him, about Jefferson and his wife. And he began to rethink freedom of speech, freedom of the press. I think he probably came around after that. But anyway, so my point is that freedom of speech, in its application, on a day-to-day basis, people who deal in media, for example, are faced with complications, are faced with nuances in what people say and how they say it, and how those of us who were in positions to allow those opinions to be expressed in the newspaper, for example, have to be careful. Later, I suppose we could go into the matter of just what's decent and what's not, whether it's legal or not. And that's an entirely different question, and it becomes a judgment call, and some people make well and other people don't. But again, it's it's always been an evolving area of law. The basic principle is as sound as it could be. As Howard mentioned, in some countries where it's being lost, the loss is profound, very serious. And in countries where we take it for granted, like this country, we need to be vigilant all the time because there are forces, often on campuses, who don't want to be offended, and therefore they try to attenuate, to weaken basic freedom of speech, freedom of expression rights. And we think on a campus, if there's any place where you can say things that might be offensive or uncomfortable, it should be on a college campus. But that trend, which started years ago, has not really let up. Okay.
All right, gentlemen, I'm gonna need you to face the audience because it's hard to hear. Yes, there you go. It's hard for those of us online to hear you well. Thank you. So how do you encourage people to exercise their freedom of speech? How do you encourage people to speak up without overplaying the call-out culture that we seem to be caught up in, where if you say something that certain people don't like, then you get canceled or you get, shamed and humiliated. How do we do that?
I have as studying theology, my favorite verse on this matter is from James: be swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger. What I see today is not many people listening well. And so I imagine most talk shows, cable shows today, the typical comment I imagine in my mind, stop talking while I'm interrupting you. And so that's the image that I have. And I'd rather hear, before I answer that question, or what you just said, I want to make sure that I heard you correctly. Is this what you said? Until you can verbalize in somebody's own words, they say, yes, you've stated accurately my position, but we love to attack straw men instead of steel men. And there's a big difference. And there's a great essay on that by somebody a few years ago. So that's what I would, I think we have a listening problem, that we aren't even hearing what somebody's really saying. And if we take time to clarify, I believe in most cases we'll find out that we aren't as far apart on a lot of issues as we thought.
And I think we also have, and I've found this as the technology of media has changed. Some would say for the better, some would say not, but that there's an accountability problem. When someone would send a letter to the editor, to my newspaper, and we would get, you know, dozens of them a day, hundreds of them a week. The requirement was, if the letter was going to be published, that we need to know first, did you write this letter? I had a clerk who did that later. And is this what you wanted to say, et cetera? You realize it's going to be published with a small headline and your name and the town from where you live. And that information, yes, they understood all that. So that accountability was built into that system. And we made a point of making sure the person who sent the letter was the person who wrote the letter, sort of thing. So that was built into the system, you know, solidly built into the system. There were occasionally somebody pulled a fast one on us in seasons, but nevertheless. So there was that accountability factor. Now, Howard mentioned talk radio, for example, but the other forms of getting your opinion out, calling a talk show is one of them, require no accountability. You know, you can get up, you can call one of the talk shows here in town or anywhere else and spout off something nonsensical or foolish or ridiculous or true. And you don't have to say who you are. You don't have to stand behind your words in a way that makes you accountable for it. That has helped, of course, in the debate because it's a free-for-all. It's gotten worse as the technology has gotten more irresponsible, allowed more irresponsibility. You know, we see that in all the platforms we use. People say things through all these various means that we have on our phones and in other sources without having to be accountable for what they say. And so while the political debate can get very nasty and very coarse, I think part of what's coarsening is the lack of accountability from the people who are saying things and you can't call them to account because you don't know who they are. So that's part of what's happened. You know, the technology is wonderful. I mean, you know, I think about what it used to take us to research a story, going to libraries, making phone calls, and all those things that you had to do. When, you know, if you're an academic one, you had to do the same thing. And now you can, you know, with a few strokes, you can get access to those libraries, to that data, to good stuff, good information. Within you know, a story that might have taken you 3 or 4 days will take you 2 or 3 hours to do the research. So the technology, of course, is wonderful, but it's subject to misuse. That misuse, I think, helps coarsen the political debate, helps coarsen the culture. And we're seeing it in nearly everything, Howard is expert on what's going on in Ukraine and Russia. I've spent a lot of his professional life there. But what we're also seeing as the debate evolves in this country is rather than looking at the situation and blaming the people who are to blame, the Russians, in this case, Putin Russians, we turn it into a political debate about why it's happening. And it happened because this person was president or that person was president or the Congress didn't do that. And so they're weaponizing this tragedy, this global historic tragedy in order to score political points. That, of course, is the debate also. It's not new, it's just worse.
Howard, you look like you want to say something. Go ahead.
I know way too much about some things that, for instance, Faith, a very good friend of David Miller, for instance, and mine, is Bob Forsman, who ran Martin's Capital of Russia for years. And he used Christopher Steele to do a lot of research for him for years. And I was with David when the first story came out about the dossier. And Bob said, Chris hasn't been in Russia since 1999. He doesn't even know what's going on. I can't believe he's the author of this dossier. And Bob went on to say, in St. Petersburg, there's an institute with about 2,000 people. They're equal opportunity offenders, and all they do is read the New York Times, Washington Post, all the great publications, and then they write comments. They're trolls. And their basic motive is to get us angry with each other. They're equal opportunity. And so this conversation where people, I mean, the truth is, I think listening is important. So I told a bunch of people 4 years ago, I said, I'm not going to even say anything more than that Christopher Steele's sources and everything is a little bit suspect. There wasn't a lot of homework done on that. And the Washington Post did acknowledge that last October. But when John Durham's study or his research is concluded and all that's going on, we're going to see that there's a lot of people that just write nasty things. They want to tear us apart, both sides. And so they are very, very good at it. And what Jack just said about the anonymity of this, back to the coddling of the American mind by Jonathan Haidt, he said our culture was ruined when Facebook put on likes and when Twitter had retweets. Those two single things were the worst thing that happened. You know, fragile kids who are being disliked and defriended and everything, and then all the retweets on the Twitter. Jonathan Haidt's argument is those things just really made our culture far more corrosive than anything. And so I think being aware that there are a lot of bad people, bad actors, in their anonymity can write whatever they want, and especially trying to stir people's passion up. And so I think we're at a very, very troublesome time with our whole discourse. And so 84% of people, surveys feel that we're way too polarized, and it is very much so. Where families are, I mean, I've got a dear friend in Washington, D.C. who ran our school in Moscow that we had. PhD in Russian history from University of Maryland, great guy. He's got 2 kids that won't speak to him and 2 siblings who won't speak to him. They have different views on masking and vaccines. And so things like this just separate, so everything gets polarized. So if you have a strong view about this, and if you, and I think one of the best books all of us can read is Arthur Brooks' Why Do We Hate Each Other? And Arthur Brooks says it's not that we just disagree, we have contempt. And he says contempt is what is destroying us. If I disagree with you, instead of talking through why and trying to come to some understanding, we write people off. So this whole idea of cancel culture is, I'm going to cancel you if you disagree with my views. So that's sort of some rambling thoughts on this, the question that you asked me.
You know, you think of, this isn't original, I heard it from someone else, but it resonates. The difference between political opponent and a political enemy, and the connotations of those two words. I think most of us who've been around a while know people who were political opponents, but respected each other, might have even been friends. The ones that come to mind immediately are the late Senator Mark Andrews and the late Senator Ted Kennedy, who were at opposite ends of the political spectrum, but were friends. Kennedy came to the farm at Mapleton. The Andrews spent time at the compound on Cape Cod. They got along politically. They didn't. But when they needed each other for something, they were able to work together. You can see what's going on in the Senate now. That's not the case. When you begin to describe your political differences as your enemy, and an enemy is something entirely different. So that separation, polarization, is reflected in our leadership, in the highest places in our leadership today.
All right, so I know there's people in the room, and I would want to leave a little space to make sure they can ask their questions. But Dennis, you're gonna have to help me with that because I can't see the audience. Is there anyone who's got a question they would like to ask our two speakers before we go?
I'm actually gonna be rude and take the first one. Now, we all know that free speech actually exists for minorities, not the people in power, because there are people in power already have speech that's protected because they have power to be able to say what they want. So free speech is really for those who don't have power to have voice. But when Howard and you were talking about this, I've been thinking about this for a while. I think it actually might lead or tie back to the loss of humility as a virtue that we try to acquire. Humility, as I see it, is you come in and you think, I might be wrong. And so you listen to others in the sense that they might know more about something than you do. What do you think? Am I way off on that? Or I'm not asking you to say you hate humility, but maybe it's not doing as much as I think it is.
If any of you have read Screwtape Letters by C.S. Lewis, he argues that the worst thing that can happen to your subject that you're trying to tempt and ruin his life is if they become humble. That's the worst thing. If they become humble, it's a problem. So what you need to do as a demon is to make them proud about being humble. Point out their humility and say, I'm more humble than others. So make them proud about being humble. So when they are proud about being humble, you've got them. And then all of a sudden they become aware that they're proud about being humble. And then they say, oh, I'm one of the few people that has the self-awareness that I'm proud about being humble. And it's an infinite sort of thing. And I do agree with you. Virtue is, I mean, all the founding fathers, when they talk about these freedoms, virtue is central to having freedom. So you have license and you have liberty, but license is going in the wrong direction, but liberty, I believe, is dependent upon genuine. And humility does involve listening to others, and taking somebody seriously, and that's hard because we have pretty strong views about lots of stuff. And if somebody disagrees with us, we're not wanting to learn from them. So you had a seminar about a month ago or 6 weeks ago with a couple of speakers that I listened online. And the one speaker rightfully pointed out John Stuart Mill's thoughts about, and it was excellent. And it's a good reminder. If I'm on any conversation with somebody, if I'm wrong, I want to learn from them where I'm wrong. If I'm partially wrong, they can help correct me. With a good conversation, I can be corrected. If I'm right, it's important for me to have the humility to learn how to persuade them that I'm right and they're wrong. And so it's just an excellent model that John Stuart Mill points out that I thought your speakers were excellent on that.
Well, I'm reminded of another philosopher and thinker, certainly not in the realm of John Stuart Mill. And he said, kind of resonating with the theme that Howard just talked about. He said in a country western song, Lord, it's hard to be humble when you're perfect in every way. I'm trying to think of the same. It's a good song. But that represents in some way, not a perfect way, of course, in some way, the culture. We talk about pride, and we talk about how pride is so much pride wrongly assessed, wrongly applied in the culture, is so much a part of who we are. I'm so proud of you going to this engineering school. God, I'm so proud that your team won. You know, pride he seems to be so woven into the tapestry of who we are as a culture that it's in everything. Our achievements. We look upon our achievements in a way that almost demands that somebody around us, even in ourselves, are prideful about it. I don't know whether that's bad or good. I have come to a conclusion about that. I think it can be bad. I think one of the things we see in Scripture is pride. So, you know, it's a difficult thing when we're in a society that so values achievement, so values success as is defined, and therefore applies a version of pride to that. You know, mothers are often proud of their kids when they achieve something, and should be, I guess. But I don't know. That seems to go to an area where you get into a difficult place where you begin to think of yourself in a way that doesn't allow you or allows you to be disdainful of others, to write them off in some ways. You know, a few years ago, the North Dakota Newspaper Association inducted me into the 50-year club because I'd been in the business counting the University of Connecticut newspaper that I worked at. I've been in the business for 50 years. So I'm at a conference in Louis, Crosby. It was Crosby during the Olympics. And so I was given this nice little plaque, which I have hanging in my office, that says, for some reason, I'm honored for being in the business for 50 years. It's because I'm old. That's it. I stayed around. There's nothing in there. You know, why that shouldn't be an award, you know, for somebody who was in 30 years or 20 years or 70. But because I, you know, have this longevity, I get this thing. Everybody pats you on the back and say, I felt pretty good about it until I realized you stay around long enough, you get all the awards. They run out of people to give awards to, you get it. And so should I feel pride about that? I did when I was younger, of course, but I put it in perspective now. And I think that the perspective is important. The perspective is what we lost, and that's why part of why the cultural debate that's going on now is so intense, and so nasty, and so divisive, and so that families have been, you know, hurt. I think that probably everyone in this room knows somebody, either their own family or saw this political climate, cultural climate in the last few years has made it difficult for them to talk to each other, let alone sit down at Thanksgiving dinner. So, you know, is that freedom of speech when we talk nasty to Uncle George? Is Uncle George is a jerk? No, it's not.
Patty Corwin has a question.
Not so much a question as just a question. I guess it is a question to everyone. I'm always looking for solutions because I teach cultural diversity, and there is just time for wild anger on just about every topic we discuss. And I finally came up with this a bit of a solution where I tell people, today we're going to talk about a pathway to citizenship for illegal aliens. And before any of you speak, we're going to get up on a mountain, and we're up in this mountain where we don't have a dog in the fight, basically. It's not about us. But we're going to now talk about all the people who are for making a pathway to citizenship. And let's think of all their reasons. And then someone writes out on the board. And I'll say, before we move on to the other side, because we're going to hear both sides always, You have to have a head nod when you really understand what their position is. You don't have to agree, but you have to understand it. So I wait, and we all do a head nod, and I'm nodding the whole time. And then we say, now we're going to do the other side. What would someone who thinks it's wrong, we shouldn't have a pathway to citizenship, think? And then everybody starts contributing, their shoulders relax a little bit, and then we do the other side, and then they have to do the head bob until when you think you understand that side. And I'll go around there and say, I didn't see your head bob. Is there a question? Oh no, I get it. So then they get the head bob. But at the end of it, I realized, and we talked about it afterwards, students have said it's been one of the most helpful things they've taken into business with them. And I know that I almost convinced myself of both sides after listening to it too. And I'm trying to find some solutions because we've had such angry discussions, and I have to start that now, the first day of class. We're going to spend a lot of time on this mountain looking down at the two sides of all these issues. And I'm trying to figure out what leaders can do. What kind of tools have they got so that you're leading something and all of a sudden the fighting starts?
All right, gentlemen, are you going to comment on what the wise Ms. Patty Corrin has said?
It's what she just said is all about listening. If I clearly hear what you have said, I need to hear that, and then sometimes I need to clarify. Is this what you said? And so it takes active listening and asking questions. I think it's a wonderful exercise.
I was pretty desperate when the fights were starting and people said, I'm afraid. I don't like coming to class because.
Well, if you'll allow a little bit of humor on this, there was this church that had fights at every annual meeting. And they would sit on each side of the church, and there's always a disagreement. And so one guy stands up to make a motion, and he says, I move that we buy a chandelier. And before he even finishes his motion, the other guy on the other side stands up and says, I object to that for two reasons. No one knows how to play a chandelier, and what we need in this church is more light. And so there's this instinctive disagreement that we have with people that we disagree with. And so it's part of it is just having, I love C.S. Lewis's statement, there's no ordinary people. There's not one person you talk, everybody is extraordinary, created in the image of God. And if you look at everybody that way, and for me, it's really hard to look at Vladimir Putin in that way. It's really, really hard. And there's others. And there is such a thing as that image being marred greatly. But if the general principle, we look at all people as having dignity and that there's not one person I can't learn something from.
But, back to the free speech theme. Sometimes when we talk about these things, it almost seems like we want everyone to get around the campfire and sing Kumbaya and agree. And that's not what free speech is about or has ever been about. But what it is about is what Howard's been emphasizing throughout the afternoon here is that listening, you have the right to talk about what you want to talk about. I might think it's outrageous, but I should listen, as you should listen if I am speaking on the other side or a different side of what you brought up. So, and I think that listening component, because of the cacophony of media and the kinds of media that has evolved in the last 20 years or so, that listening aspect of it has been lost. It was never perfect, but it was pretty good for a long time. But we're at the point now where someone might just start to say something that you're going to disagree with instinctively, viscerally, and boom, you write them off, or you interrupt, or you completely, write them off in a way not polite. Polite's okay. Polite's good. Manners, manners is a good thing. And I think that that's part of listening. Courtesy. You don't have to agree. You're not going to agree. But courtesy to listen. Even if the person, that you're interacting with is not a listener, himself or herself. You be the listener. Set the example. Free speech thrives, I think, when people hear it. But if you don't take the opportunity to hear it, you write it off because you completely disagree or you assume that the speaker is, whatever the speaker is saying is so anathema to your own beliefs that you just don't even listen, then we're in real trouble. I think we're in real trouble. And you get the sense of, there's a lot of doomsday talk out there that the country is in trouble like it's never been before. Didn't anybody study the Civil War? We've been in trouble before. Didn't anybody, the Watergate era, we've had problems. There are thinkers who think that this is different, that there's a deeper division going on here that's very dangerous for the country. I like to think, and maybe I'm the Pollyanna in the room about this, I like to think that the basic foundational structures of this country that were put together by the people who wrote the Declaration and wrote the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and the attendant documents that have come along since then. I like to think that's still sound, that it's strong, and that good people in this country will prevail over time. This period that we're in now, might be seen as one of the most difficult, dangerous periods in the country since the Civil War in terms of division. But I still think that there's a center there. Most of them have been shouted down by the left and the right, but there's a center there that still understands that strength and that foundation. Maybe not academically, but instinctively. This country, it's different. It's been different from the beginning. So I really like to think in order to sleep at night, that the country will get through this and come out wiser.
It seems like so often, especially on college campuses, that people don't want to hear opposing viewpoints. And the speakers will be shouted down, or there'll be protests that prevent people from coming to campus in the first place. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts about that, or what can be done maybe on the university level to try to get around that or prevent those sorts of things from happening.
That's where Jonathan Haidt's, the Heterodox Academy that's been started, and Robbie George at Princeton, who happens to be on the board of the Ethics and Public Policy Center, which I have the privilege. He and Cornell West, who's a Marxist, go around college campuses having a conversation to show how they can disagree on almost everything, but still really like each other and have this. And it's just been it's a Cornell and Robbie George show. They've done it on a number of college campuses, but I don't know fully why there is this fear for so many academicians to really allow complete freedom of ideas. There's got to be a fear of some sort. And I'm not a psychologist to understand why. There clearly is a mood on the part of a lot of people not to hear other ideas. And I'd say it's most pervasive. In fact, who was it that said out of the great, the elite schools in our country, the University of Chicago has a pretty soft statement on freedom of speech, but so many schools, there's this sameness of thought that if you disagree with this, you're to be canceled. I experienced that 4 years. I taught at Concordia for 4 years and became very close friends with Gordon Lyle, the Shakespeare professor. We had just a wonderful, wonderful relationship. We play tennis together. I want an unnamed religion professor with a PhD from an elite university came to Gordon, said, Gordon, you shouldn't be spending so much time with Howard Dahl. His views are dangerous. Here's a PhD from an elite religious university. And I had some give and take with this particular professor over some things that were very, very interesting. But he felt that he needed to warn Gordon well. And then Gordon became very, very distraught by the mid-90s when there were these voices that you can't just read Shakespeare for pleasure. You need to see Shakespeare as a white male, and you have to see the power. And so, and Gordon became distraught. And yes, there are issues about that, but when everything becomes power, so you can't even read a poem for the sake of just enjoying the poem, but you have to see who the author is and what their agenda was in writing it. And I think that's where so much of academia is. It's all about power and power structures. And that, as I said, I'm not a psychologist, but I fear that that's what's going on with a lot of people who don't want to hear any opposing views.
Yeah, I found this mentioned John Stewart Mill, 1859, on liberty. There ought to exist the fullest liberty of professing and discussing as a matter of ethical conviction any doctrine, however moral it may be considered. Mill argues that the fullest liberty of expression is required, which arguments to the logical limits rather than the limits of social embarrassment. We say, yeah, you know, especially you would think on a university campus, a place of ideas, and no idea, you know, however offensive it might be, or however benign it might be, should be suppressed in the way that you described, and it is. But this isn't so new. When I was in school, you know, back when we were on campus, you know, jobs were filling with gas lights. We were beginning to see in the dormitories, and this is after the civil rights movement, when, you know, the 1965 Act and all the things of Martin Luther King and all the things that he had said, the movement that seemed to be moving in the right direction. We began to see groups self-segregating and the university going along with it. There was an area in the dining hall that was the Black area. Negro was the word at the time, you know, and you kind of wondered, all the progress that was supposed to be being made, why? Why, not only why was this happening, but why was the university sanctioning it? And, you know, I had an algebra teacher in high school. Arthur Coggins was his name. He's dead, and that's a good thing. And this is in enlightened New England. Arthur Coggins, good algebra teacher. I think I couldn't get it, but he, the first week of his classes, 8th grade, I think, 9th grade maybe. No, it was high school. It was 10th grade algebra. Anyway, he would line up students, and he would have written across the blackboard. They were blackboards then. Birds of a feather flock together. And we'd come in, what the hell's that? And what he would do then is he would separate people by his biases. Pretty girls were here, the less attractive girls by his assessment were here. The black boys were up there in the corner. You know, I happen to be Polish. He says, "You Polish?" And yeah, well, you sit over there. So I'd sit with, you know, the other skis. He got away with that for years. After I left that high school, the yearbook was dedicated to him. Maybe because he was retiring. But the other side of that is he was one good algebra teacher. But you see what I'm saying? These things were in the society, in us, as we moved into our lives, as we moved into our professions, as we moved into interactions with other people. These things were in us. And sometimes, and you know, we didn't think anything of it. Yeah, that's the way Coggins does it. That's okay. You know, march over there. He belongs with the homely girls. You know, but that kind of stuff. And so it was not exactly routine because there was a shocking factor of it, but it was almost like, geez, isn't it? You know, but it was part of the culture. Not that long ago. And I think it's, you know, I hear it. You know, I hear stuff from young men, mostly young men, that I know mostly through my family, who are outrageously biased, prejudiced, racist. You know, it's 2022. These guys are 30 years old, 40 years old. What did they miss? What have we missed? What's going on?
You see it now, even with like, I'm a freshman, you could like see it with people in my grade. You notice it even.
Yeah. And you know, I'd like to think that we were beyond that, but we're not by a long shot. And you know, again, back to the theme, maybe some aspects of free speech, some aspects of the debate around free speech feed into that because people retreat into their own beliefs and they react badly. So racism is easy for them. Being disdainful of a group is easy for them. It's comfortable for them. It's defensive for them. And then they fall back on, hey, it's a free country. I can say whatever I want. Then what? So I don't know. And he said, I think it shows up on campuses both in the left and right. Mostly on the left, though, I have to say. Mostly on the left, on some of the other campuses.
So, Faith, can we ask you a question?
Sure, Howard.
Because you know you've thought so much about. You know, can you see what I look like? I'm not seeing you. I wanted to turn around and see you, but
I can see you when you face the audience.
Well, okay, I'll do that. Faith. Okay, then I can look at you. I flew on a plane with a Kenyan who grew up in the bush, and somebody saw he has some skills, sent him to a boarding school, and then sent him to America for college and a master's degree. He was a senior auditor for Ernst & Young, doing the Microsoft account in Fargo. We sat by each other. We had this fascinating visit. And I said, the next time you come to Fargo, can we get together? So he came to my office for a couple hours. And he said, I would love to go back to Kenya and make a difference. I'd love to be involved in some leadership. He said, but we have 5 tribal groups in Kenya that, so instead of talking about race, it's the other. We talk about the other, anybody who's different. So in Kenya, you experience, so I think a lot of people don't realize the other can be all sorts of categories.
Yeah.
And you know, you've done so much thinking about leadership. You've looked at your own country where you grew up. And I really appreciate your views on how, you know, the other, how do we bridge those discussions with the other? I know you're the moderator, you can speak to this.
Oh God, that's a big one. The other can be anybody, right? The other can be tribe, can be race, can be gender, can be sexual identities, right? Because as human beings, we are tribal, right? We want to associate with those who are most like us. And so these things that we're discussing, they're important globally, not just, you know, in the US or in the global North. They're important everywhere. I think what you you said about, we need to be slow to judge and quicker to forgive, and right, we need to be open to hearing the other. In Kenya, this is an election year. So you can imagine how much noise there is, right? As these politicians do this business where, you might be in this party today, but tomorrow you shift to the other one because you think that's where power is going to flow. And the next day you shift to another one. And, people call each other whatever they want to call each other. At the end of the day, nobody's actually listening. But what gives me hope is that I see in the younger people a willingness to listen and a willingness to try to understand where others are coming from. So that tribe may have been important in my mother's generation, tribe may have been important, for those who are in their 60s. Tribe is not important for those who are in their 20s and those who are in their 30s. So we're seeing that boundaries are being broken, not just because people have, intermarried and all that kind of stuff, but also they've begun to realize we have more in common than what we have that differentiates us. So at the end of the day, it's about, there has to be listening. And I like, what Danny said about humility. The awareness that we don't always know everything, that we're not always right, that we can always learn from the other. That I think is very important to encouraging, debate and dialogue and conversation, as opposed to the screaming match that we see on social media, which then gets repeated on mainstream media, then goes back to social media, and the important things are not being discussed because we're too busy shouting. I hope that answers, but that's what I'm thinking at this point, because I'm spending a lot more time in Kenya than before, and I'm getting to see, what's happening there, what's happening here, and what's happening around the world. People have become more tribal. They're retreating to their groups. There's fear, right, that is spread about the other. Even the pandemic has made that worse, right? With when we started calling COVID the Chinese virus, right? You're afraid of the other, therefore you retreat into your own tribe. But the young people are, at least for me, my hope that, it will change, right? That we're not going to be stuck in this space of polarization forever. Something's got to give, and the young are going to be the prophets of that change. Thank you for asking me to speak, Howard.
You are a treasure, Faith, and I know there's good steps ahead of you.
Question, if I may. Can you speak to the concept of free speech, specifically the First Amendment was penned at a certain time and place? Would the framers who wrote that amendment, were they a visitor to our society today and spent long enough time here to see what was going on? Would they say, whoa, this is exactly what we had in mind? Or the limits of free speech have grown, or what can you speak to that?
Well, Jack went through a lot of the case studies, but I mean, the framers, there was a mixture of rich Enlightenment thought, natural law theory, influence from the first Great Awakening with Jonathan Edwards, who had a great influence on Witherspoon, who had the influence on Madison. So you have all these different, but there's one thing they had in common, that these thoughts about these great freedoms that Ukraine has, and hopefully will keep, Russia does not have freedom of speech, press, religion, and assembly. They just saw how important that was. But they also said it only will work with a virtuous society. And so, but they, so it clearly at the beginning, they just saw that the way you hash out ideas is through great debate, great discussion. And so that's, and it's not just brand new to them. I mean, you have some thoughts through the early English Enlightenment that, but it was just the value of how you shape your ideas is through exchange of ideas. And so I fear that is not treasured today, in that most people just, they want to form their own opinions, and they don't want to listen to other opinions. So people who love Fox News, that's all they listen to. People who love MSNBC, that's all they, so it totally shapes, and it feels a little bit like Soviet Union propaganda, if all you listen to it. And that's why there's some well-meaning Russians who all they listen to is Channel 1 in Russia, and they really believe, I mean, I've got somebody I respect a great deal, he's a devout Orthodox believer. He really believes Ukraine is full of Nazis, and that this Jewish president is a Nazi, and that Holy Russia is doing something necessary to denazify Ukraine. He really believes that.
He doesn't see the irony of a Jewish president being a Nazi.
No, he doesn't. And I fortunately have enough relationship. He's the one person I've been able to, I think, get through to a little bit. But it's, if all you listen to is a certain perspective, you're going to become like that. One of the wisest things I learned is, like a 21-year-old, someone told me, you're going to be the same person 5 years from now you are today, with the exception of what you read and who you spend time with. The most two important things is who you spend time with and what you read. And so what is going into your mind as you read? And I still think about that. I think about, you know, who's going to shape me and influence me. Because I think I've learned more in the last 5 years than I learned in any 5 years of my life. And so lifelong learning is just a wonderful. I've had a lot of corrections in my thinking, and but I don't know if that answered your question, Bill, about the following, how they would see free speech. They clearly believe that virtue was central to free speech. And I think they'd be alarmed at college campuses shutting down, you know, free speech like we had in the late 60s, all the free speech platforms that we had. I was at Cornell University 2 summers, and we talked to these students who said, what we need is to overthrow the US government, and we've got to bring in, we've got to destroy it and bring it. And I said, well, what do you want to bring in? Chinese communism. I mean, this is the height of the Chinese, this is 1970, and so there was free speech, and you know, those ideas that were there. And if I could add one thing about who I believe is silencing most free speech, and people say critical race theory is fine. Well, if you go to critical theory and you study Herbert Marcuse, who has had an enormous influence on a lot of thinking, his view is we need to shut down people who have bad ideas. We need to make sure they don't have a voice. And so that, from the Frankfurt School, and he came to the US to begin teaching in the late 60s, had a big influence on a lot of the people that I met in the late 60s, early 70s. And so if you read Marcuse, strong view that views that we disagree with, we need to silence. And so I think there's enough people who have embraced that view of the world.
So we have a question on the chat that I would like to read by Davis Cope. He says, listening, is this what you mean, is an individual act, but requires one-on-one interaction. Accountability, which is taking responsibility by identification, is an individual act, but requires mass action to be effective. Also enforcement by media. Can you comment on these limitations?
The last part, enforced by media?
Enforcement by media. He might need to say more about that, but.
Well, first part, listening. That's one. I fully agree. The best listening, the best interaction is one-on-one when you truly hear somebody. And that, when I say my views have changed a lot over 5 years, last 5 years, it's through wonderful interaction with people that, as I've listened to them, I've changed my ideas on a number of things. And the accountability, is how we deal with what we've heard. And but I didn't quite get the media reinforcement. Maybe you could repeat the question, or
Davies, if you're listening, please write some more about that part.
No, I don't see how that connects, but on the accountability part of this question, accountability, I think, is bound together with personal responsibility. I mean, you're accountable to whom, I guess might be the question. Who are you accountable to? And I think part of it has to be an understanding that you have a personal aspect, a personal responsibility, of the decency aspect, to be accountable to your own values. And I think people have lost that because they're so angry. And so they spout off and know, because of what's happened in the last few years, they are not going to be called to account, or rarely will be called to account. And if they are, there are no consequences. So whereas accountability is a one-on-one relationship also, it has other segments to it, other facets to it, other nuances to it, that can't really be dismissed. And I think that takes, in addition to wanting to listen, that it takes self-analysis, to say to yourself, listen, I'm going to say this, I'm accountable for my words, I'm responsible for what I say, for what it means, for the impact it might have. I used to do that when I wrote, because I was always surprised sometimes by the reaction. So there's a personal aspect to these questions, that question, that I think has to do with maybe your own growth as a person, the values that are part of you, that make you tick, that almost define the way you act and interact with other people. And I think, again, part of maybe when he's talking about the media, talking about the changes in media, there are the technical, the new media have pretty much allowed people to get away with not being personally responsible, not being accountable. So maybe that's what he's asking. And I think there's something to that, because it's easy to say something outrageous and then, go to have a cup of coffee. And that's what's going on.
I think that's what he was asking. He's clarified. That's what he was asking. Dennis, how are we doing on time?
I know there are a couple more questions in the chat, if we could do those. And I think if we stop at about 10 minutes, if our speakers could hold up for another 10 minutes.
All right.
Let's hope.
So one of the other questions was from Roxanne Salonen, and she asked, do either of the speakers think a decline in morality contributes to the breakdown of communication?
Yes. And hubris and arrogance are bad. C.S. Lewis argued in Mere Christianity that all the 7 deadly sins are a subset of pride. You know, envy, greed, lust, they're all a subset of inordinate pride. And so he says that's the big one. And the Romans did not consider pride a vice. And so there's an interesting dynamic. And so I would say that, yeah, I think there's a serious erosion of virtue, morality in our culture. I think it's very coarsened by music, by videos, by video games, and on and on and on. I think there's a lot of stuff shaping us that is unhealthy. And I think I've got grandkids, 8 grandkids, and I'm concerned about what they are exposed to. The loss of innocence, the loss of childhood. I have a lot of fears about that. So yes, I think we need a 3rd grade awakening in our country.
We get into a difficult area when we talk about morality, in the sense that I think we understand it. Then we get into religion, and then we get into the values that we give lip service to, but don't really live. When we look at some of the indicators of how morality is measured and how the values of the society are measured, one of those, I think, is, and it's not the only one, of course, is church attendance. And you look at the numbers that come out every year from the religious census and other sources, and you see the decline in most parts of the country, not here yet, in religious attendance, church attendance. That is an indicator that aspect of life that many of us of a certain age grew up with is not part of the younger generation, which I believe, has great potential and all that stuff. People that colleges seeking on campuses believe that also. But that foundational morality, nobody likes the word, that's one of those words, virtue, standards of behavior, conduct that come down to us from nearly all our religions, but in our Judeo-Christian tradition, are not being taught in the same way, generally in society, for lots of reasons. And if they are taught in some places, they're taught with an edge to them that drives people away or divides people. There's a lot of that going on. You can see it on television all the time. So there's a loss there. Let me give you one example. A few years ago, I was in Vermont visiting my daughter and the grandchildren. It was Easter. My daughter is a graduate of Concordia. I grew up as a Catholic, thought better of it, became a Lutheran, and have been serious about it. So I said to my daughter, who, despite her education at Oak Grove and Concordia and at home, is not serious about it. I said, Easter, let's get the kids and go down to the church on the green in this beautiful village in Vermont, which had, typical white church and the green and all that stuff, congregational church, I guess. She's sure. So we're getting ready to go. Easter Sunday morning. It's getting on toward 10 when the service is supposed to start. I says, well, come on, let's go. We're not going to be able to park. We're going to have to park way at the other end of the green. And my daughter says, relax. Okay. So we get there. A few minutes to 10. It's Easter Sunday. A few minutes to 10. Park right in front of the church. Right at that end of the green. Park right in front of the church. Walk into the church and get ready for the service. There were 26 people in the church 6 of them were us. Easter Sunday in rural Vermont. And I talked to the minister and his wife afterwards. I said, how do you keep going? He said, well, we have a couple of heavy hitter families to keep things going, that sort of thing. And they were able to use the building for other purposes. And I said, well, and of course, then he explained what I already knew, that the Northeast in particular is the most unchurched part of the country. And that's always surprises me because I grew up in an industrial city in the Connecticut River Valley in Connecticut, which was ethnic and, you know, and church, in my case, Catholic church, was an integral part of life, not only on Sunday, but all the time. My parents were first generation Americans, and my grandparents were European. And so that tradition was still part of life. I think that here, a generation removed, it's not. And it doesn't seem to matter sometimes whether there's been a foundation of religious education, you know, Sunday school, community college. It doesn't seem to matter. And I wonder about why. So that moral aspect, whether some people just to hear it makes it cringe, but whether it's important to the way the society is going, I think a lot of it was instilled in us in church life, whether we stayed with the church or not, whether we rejected the ritual or the structure or the politics of the church, the spirituality, if you will, but also the values, the laws that come down through the tradition, stay with us. If you don't do that, if you don't have that, it's not a common kind of set of values and standards throughout society, you got problems. And I think there's not that everybody has to believe the same way. There are certain values, certain standards, and certain beliefs that make the society healthy. Losing something. Yes. Oh, God is talking. I don't know.
Seems to me that morality is being taught as something that's totally subjective, which is totally different than when I was growing up. And it seems to me that is going to ultimately lead to a chaotic society when everybody can determine their own morality.
Well, if I can quote the very, very influential philosopher of the late 19th century, Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche said, God is dead, we killed him. And now there's no good or evil. We move beyond good and evil. And we have everything's about power. And so I think in almost a prophetic way, if life is totally subjective, it's just my opinion against yours, then it does become all about power. And I think he saw clearly what lies ahead. And you can see the same things in the writings of Dostoevsky, his great liturgy. Ivan Karamazov says, if God is dead, everything is permitted. So it's one of the quotes in the Grand Inquisitor section of the Brothers' Gate.
I'm going to have to do my duties as host of this event and draw us to a close. I want to thank our speakers, Howard Dahl and Jack Zaleski, for really taking us on an interesting conversation. The Northern Plains Ethics Institute, one of the things we do, as folks who know us, we want civil conversations on difficult topics. I think everybody could say this was very civil and very enlightening. I also want to thank Faith Gurngiri for her wonderful job moderating this and wish her the best in her future career, since she deserves so much. And I also want to let folks know on April 1st at noon, we will be having Stanley Fish give a talk. Professor Fish is the author of the award-winning Winning Arguments, and he's going to be talking about academic freedom and free speech. He is relatively controversial because he likes to challenge people. So you get to see a different approach to the topic that we're looking at. If you have any questions or comments, please send them to the NDSU, NPEI. More than happy to chat with you. Let's thank our speakers and moderator and our audience.